Sonar has just found a World War II aircraft carrier sitting on the ocean floor that the United States Navy deliberately sank in secret. When researchers examined the wreck and cross-referenced it with declassified military records, what they discovered inside the hull left experts stunned. This ship was not carrying aircraft. It was not carrying ammunition in any conventional sense. It was loaded, boat astern, with chemical weapons, mustard gas, and nerve agents, substances so dangerous that experts say they should never have been put aboard a vessel in the first place. And this ship is not alone. There are dozens more like it scattered across the ocean floor, some off the coast of Florida, some off New Jersey, some off California. The military's own records cannot account for where all of them ended up. Somewhere off the coast of the United States, resting on the ocean floor in thousands of feet of water, there are ships the military does not want you to know about. They are not warships sunk in battle. They are not submarines lost to enemy torpedoes. They are cargo vessels, deliberately loaded with some of the deadliest substances ever manufactured by human beings, towed out to sea and sent to the bottom on purpose. The United States military admits to dumping at least 64 million pounds of chemical weapons into the ocean. Mustard gas, nerve agents, lewisite, 400,000 chemical-filled bombs, landmines, and rockets, and more than 500 tons of radioactive waste. All of it pushed overboard or packed into the holds of scuttled ships and sent to the bottom. And here is the part that should concern you. The Army does not know exactly where half of it went. To understand how this happened, you need to go back to 1945. The war in Europe was over. The Allied forces had won, and they had a problem no one had anticipated. Across occupied Germany, military teams were discovering enormous stockpiles of chemical weapons. Nearly 300,000 tons of them, artillery shells filled with mustard gas, bombs loaded with nerve agents, barrels of lewisite, a blistering agent so toxic that a single drop on exposed skin causes chemical burns that take months to heal. The Allies had their own stockpiles too. The United States had manufactured vast quantities of chemical weapons throughout the war, stationed across bases in Europe, the Pacific, and on American soil. Now all of it needed to be destroyed. But in 1945, the science of safely destroying chemical weapons did not exist. There were no incinerators rated for nerve agent, no neutralization plants, no tested protocols. The weapons existed, and the world needed them to not exist. The solution, the only solution anyone could agree on, was the ocean. The thinking was simple. The ocean is vast. Seawater would dilute anything dropped into it. Chemical agents would break down, the depths would swallow whatever sank, and the currents would disperse whatever leaked. It seemed logical. It was also catastrophically wrong, but the men making these decisions could not have known that, or perhaps they did not want to know. Either way, the dumping began. The first major operation was called Davy Jones's Locker. A military newspaper published in Bremen, Germany, described the scene. At 4 p.m. on June 28, 1946, 3 living cargoes of death staggered northward from the quayside waters of northern Germany. It was a funeral procession, the first of its kind. A tinge of uneasiness drifted in with the fog. Between June 1946 and August 1948, the United States and Britain scuttled 38 ships containing between 30,000 and 40,000 tons of captured German chemical weapons. 9 of those ships were sunk in the Skagerrak Strait, connecting the Baltic Sea to the North Sea. 2 more went down in the North Sea itself. The ships were gutted cargo vessels, loaded to capacity with shells, bombs, barrels, and canisters of poison. Among them was the former German light cruiser Leipzig, loaded with 6,500 tons of chemical ammunition. On July 20th, 1946, at 10:59 in the morning, she was sunk by explosion southwest of the Norwegian town of Farsund. Crews opened seacocks and watched the other vessels disappear beneath the surface one by one. The sinking areas had been chosen based on a wartime rule that seemed reasonable at the time. The water had to be at least 100 meters deep and at least 18 kilometers from the nearest coast. Norwegian authorities granted permission for the dumping in a narrow strip of water about 14 kilometers long and 4 kilometers wide, 40 to 50 kilometers southeast of the town of Arendal. The confidentiality agreement on these operations remained in place until 2017. For more than 70 years, the full details of what was dumped and where were classified. But Davy Jones's locker was just the beginning. The policy at the close of World War II was straightforward. Any chemical weapons stockpiled overseas were to be dumped off the coast of whatever country they were in. Australia, Japan, India, Norway, France, Italy. The list goes on. American chemical weapons were loaded onto ships at bases around the world and pushed into the sea. The records of how much was dumped and where were, at best, inconsistent. In many cases, the soldiers carrying out the disposal treated it the way you would treat taking out the garbage. No one thought to write down exactly what went into the water or precisely where it was dropped. There were no GPS coordinates, no detailed manifests, just rough nautical positions scribbled in logs that would later be lost, misfiled, or destroyed. If you are still following this, you have seen how the world's most powerful military decided to solve its chemical weapons problem by hiding it underwater. But what happened next is where the story gets dangerous. Because the dumping did not stop after the war. It accelerated. In 1958, the SS William C. Ralston was loaded with 301,000 mustard gas bombs and 1,500 one-ton containers of lewisite at a military depot in California. The ship was towed roughly 100 miles off the coast of San Francisco, and the seacocks were opened. The Ralston sank into approximately 14,000 feet of water. It sits there today, 300,000 chemical bombs in the holds of a rotting ship, less than 2 hours by boat from one of America's largest cities. And nobody monitored the site after the ship went down. Nobody checked to see if the containers were leaking. Nobody measured the water quality. The Ralston was sunk and forgotten. Then came Operation Chase. The name was an acronym: Cut Holes and Sink M. It was the Pentagon's official program for disposing of obsolete munitions at sea, running from 1964 through the early 1970s. Most chase operations involved conventional weapons, but 4 of them carried chemical agents. The method was consistent. Take an old Liberty ship, load it with munitions at a naval weapons station, tow it at least 250 miles offshore, then scuttle it. The ships were sunk by having explosive ordnance disposal teams open the seacocks after the vessel reached the disposal site. The typical Liberty ship took about 3 hours to sink after the seacocks were opened. 3 hours of slowly settling into the ocean while the holds filled with water and the cargo shifted and groaned under its own weight. The chemical weapons disposal site was a 3-mile patch of Atlantic Ocean between Florida and the Bahamas. Not every sinking went as planned. In September of 1964, the cargo ship Village was loaded with over 7,000 tons of munitions and towed to a deep-water dump site. 5 minutes after she slipped beneath the surface, 3 massive unexpected detonations ripped through the water. The explosions registered on seismic equipment all over the world. Governments sent inquiries about seismic activity off the east coast of the United States. The military had not anticipated detonation. The ocean, it turned out, was not as forgiving as they had assumed. Chase 8, in June of 1967, sank the SS Corporal Eric G. Gibson, loaded with mustard gas and sarin-filled rockets. Chase 10 loaded 3,000 tons of nerve agent-filled rockets encased in concrete vaults aboard the SS LeBaron Russell Briggs. That ship was towed 300 miles off the Florida coast and sunk in over 16,000 feet of water. 12,508 nerve gas rockets went to the bottom. The military sent a probe down to check on them in January of 1974. The probe found no visible signs of leaking and plenty of sea life swimming around the wreck. But that was 1974, over 50 years ago. Nobody has checked since. Nobody knows what those rockets look today. Nobody knows whether the concrete vaults have cracked. Nobody knows whether the casings have corroded through. The military's position is that the weapons are in deep enough water that they do not pose a risk. But that position is based on a single observation made more than half a century ago. Chase 10 almost did not happen. By 1969, the American public had learned about the program. A congressman named Richard McCarthy obtained documents from the Pentagon and went public. The story exploded. In 1970 alone, the three major television networks aired 58 separate reports on Operation Chase. The New York Times covered it in 42 separate issues. The outcry was enormous. Grassroots resistance formed around the loading operations at Sunny Point, North Carolina, where chemical-filled munitions were being transferred onto ships. Residents feared accidents during transit. Scientists warned of ecological catastrophe, but the military argued the rockets were already leaking and had to be disposed of immediately. They had no alternative method, so the LeBaron Russell Briggs was loaded and sunk in August of 1970. It was the last time the United States military buried chemical weapons at sea. 2 years later, Congress banned the practice entirely. But the damage was already done, and the scale of that damage is what the military has spent decades trying to avoid confronting. The Army completed an internal report in 2001 that shocked even the officials who commissioned it. 74 separate dumping operations had been documented, 32 off American shores, 42 off foreign coasts. Chemical weapons dump sites ring the United States, concealed off at least 11 states, 6 on the East Coast, 2 on the Gulf Coast, California, Hawaii, Alaska, and those are just the ones they know about. The Army has rough nautical coordinates for only half of the 26 identified domestic dump sites. Thousands of World War II records had been destroyed over the decades. Filing cabinets had been cleaned out. Storage rooms had been purged. Whatever documentation had once existed for many of these operations was simply gone. And here's the detail that should alarm anyone who fishes, swims, or lives near the American coastline. Only one of those 26 sites has ever been marked on a nautical chart. This means that every day, commercial fishing vessels drag their nets across the ocean floor in areas where chemical weapons are slowly corroding. And the fishermen have no idea. In the summer of 2004, a clam dredging operation off the coast of New Jersey pulled up an old artillery shell from the ocean floor. The shell was coated in sediment and looked unremarkable. It was tossed in with the day's catch and eventually ended up at a processing plant in Delaware, where clam shells were crushed and sold as driveway fill. That shell was shipped to a home in Delaware and spread across a residential driveway. It contained mustard gas. When bomb disposal technicians from Dover Air Force Base arrived to dismantle it, a black tar-like substance began dripping from the casing. 3 technicians were injured. One was hospitalized with large pus-filled blisters covering his hands and arms. Sulfur mustard, in solid form, had survived decades on the ocean floor, traveled through a commercial fishing operation, passed through a processing plant, and ended up in a family's driveway. Nobody in the chain had any idea what they were handling. That was not an isolated incident. In 2010, commercial fishermen dredging for clams off Long Island, New York, pulled up munitions in their nets. While trying to dump them back overboard, a shell cracked open on the deck. One crew member named Konstantin Bernchoff was rushed to a hospital in Worcester, Massachusetts. Doctors found blisters 3/4 of an inch high on his arm and leg. A toxicologist recognized the injuries immediately as consistent with sulfur mustard exposure. Chemical analysis confirmed it. Another crew member reported nose and eye irritation. A third felt lightheaded. The Coast Guard attempted to locate the 2 shells the crew had tossed back overboard in about 60 feet of water, 45 miles south of Long Island. They acknowledged that finding them would be extremely difficult. In 2012, another mustard-loaded projectile turned up at a clam processing plant in Delaware. The fishermen told investigators something chilling. They said they routinely pull up munitions that smell like garlic. That garlic smell is a known indicator of chemical warfare agents. This is not just an American problem. Off the coast of Italy, near the port of Bari, 232 fishermen have been injured by encounters with dumped chemical weapons since 1946. 5 have died. Off the coast of Japan, 85 fishermen have been burned. In the Baltic Sea, where the Soviet Union dumped an estimated 15,000 tons of chemical weapons in relatively shallow water, hundreds more have been hurt. Between 1985 and 1992 alone, Baltic Sea fishermen brought up more than 17 tons of old World War II chemical munitions in their nets. In 1997, a Polish fishing crew pulled a 7-kilogram chunk of yellowish clay from their nets. They handled it with bare hands. They set it aside and tossed it in a dockside trash can when they returned to port. The next day, all of them developed agonizing symptoms. 4 were hospitalized with severe chemical burns. The substance was sulfur mustard from World War II, frozen solid on the ocean floor and perfectly preserved. A chemist who later studied the substance in a laboratory accidentally exposed his hand to sulfur mustard vapors from a test tube. The chemical burned part of his index finger. It took 2 months to heal, even with modern medical care. The pain was so severe he could not sleep more than a few hours at a time during the first month. That was from vapor exposure to a tiny amount. The fisherman had handled a 7-kilogram chunk with bare hands. Scientists who study these weapons say that mustard gas does not behave the way the military assumed it would. It does not dissolve in seawater. It does not break down. Instead, it undergoes a process called hydrolysis that forms a thick, crusted outer layer. Inside that crust, the mustard agent remains active. It becomes a dense gel that sits on the ocean floor for at least 5 years, possibly much longer, rolling with the currents. When disturbed, it is just as dangerous as the day it was manufactured. Nerve agents behave differently. Sarin breaks down in seawater within weeks, but during those weeks, it kills virtually everything it touches, and the byproducts created when nerve agents interact with seawater may cause cancer and genetic mutations in marine life. Norwegian scientists who examined chemical weapons dumped off Norway's coast concluded that the corroding steel casings create a time-delayed release of deadly chemicals that could continue for the next 100 years. In 1987, hundreds of dolphins washed ashore along the coastlines of Virginia and New Jersey. Many had burns on their skin, consistent with mustard gas exposure. One marine mammal specialist who examined the carcasses suspected a connection to the chemical weapons dumped nearby. The military never confirmed or denied the link. No investigation was launched. The dolphins were cleaned up and the beaches were reopened. The incident was forgotten. But the weapons that may have caused it are still on the ocean floor, less than 200 miles from where those dolphins washed ashore. The full scale of what is sitting on the ocean floor is staggering. Researchers at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies calculated in 2017 that approximately 1.6 million tons of chemical munitions are resting on the seafloor worldwide. 1.6 million tons, spread across roughly 150 to 300 sites in virtually every ocean and nearly every sea on Earth. And that number only accounts for what researchers have been able to document. The actual total could be significantly higher because records for many dumping operations, particularly Soviet and early American ones, were never properly maintained. In 2006, Congress finally demanded answers. Section 314 of the John Warner National Defense Authorization Act required the Department of Defense to review its records, identify dump sites, research the environmental effects, and report back on whether cleanup was feasible. It took the Pentagon a decade to complete the study. They contracted the University of Hawaii to survey a known dump site south of Pearl Harbor. Using side-scan sonar, researchers detected hundreds of reflective objects scattered across the ocean floor between 900 to 1,500 feet deep, arranged in cookie crumb trails across the seabed. The pattern matched what you would expect from munitions being shoved overboard one after another as a ship moved forward. When remotely operated vehicles were sent down for a closer look, they confirmed the objects were military munitions, warheads and canisters, 3 to 6 feet long, littering the ocean floor in long, scattered lines. The Department of Defense had a long list of weapons it claimed were dumped somewhere in this area. The problem, as researchers noted, was that where exactly was not well established. They sampled sediments. They tested water. They found chemical agents in the sediment near the munitions. They found explosive residue in shrimp. And then, in 2016, the Department of Defense delivered its final report to Congress. The conclusion was stunning. The Pentagon determined that it would not clean up any of the sites. The report stated that removing sea-disposed munitions would have, and these are the Pentagon's own words, more serious effects on marine life and the ocean environment than leaving them in place. The military's official position is that the safest thing to do with 1 million tons of chemical weapons on the ocean floor is nothing. Leave them where they are, let them corrode, hope for the best. James Barton, a federally recognized munitions expert, called this conclusion utter nonsense. He said the decision was driven by economics, not legitimate science. A CDC-commissioned report, co-authored by Barton, offered a starkly different assessment of the risk. But the Pentagon's position has not changed. The weapons stay where they are, and the ocean does what it does. Meanwhile, the world is moving into these waters. Wind farm construction requires driving pylons into the ocean floor, exactly the kind of disturbance that can rupture corroding munitions. In Germany alone, authorities record between 1 and 5 cases per year of beachgoers being burned by white phosphorus, a byproduct of chemical weapons that they mistake for pieces of amber on the shore. Undersea cable laying for telecommunications and power drags equipment across the seabed. Deep water oil and gas exploration pushes into areas that were once considered too remote to matter, and commercial fishing operations, driven by declining stocks closer to shore, are trawling deeper and farther from the coast with every passing year. Researchers have noted that commercial fishing vessels have been forced to go farther and farther from shore over the past 25 years because fish populations closer to the coast have declined. No one has studied whether the chemical weapons on the ocean floor have contributed to that decline. No one has even asked the question. Each of these activities increases the probability that someone will hit something that has been sitting on the ocean floor since the 1940s, waiting. The parallel to the submarine story is uncomfortable. Just as U-3135 disappeared because records were misfiled, much of America's underwater chemical arsenal has effectively vanished because records were never properly kept. The Army treated ocean dumping the way you would treat taking out the trash. It was done quickly, documented poorly, and forgotten immediately. The ocean was supposed to be big enough to absorb the problem. Now, decades later, the canisters are corroding, the shells are leaking, and the people who encounter them, fishermen mostly, have no warning and no protection. The question is not whether these weapons will continue to surface. They already are. Clam fishermen in Delaware and New Jersey routinely pull up munitions. Polish trawlers in the Baltic haul in chunks of mustard agent. Italian fishermen near Bari know the risks and fish those waters anyway because they have no choice. The question is whether anyone will do something about it before a large-scale release occurs, because the steel casings are not getting thicker, the ocean currents are not getting weaker, and 1.6 million tons of chemical weapons do not become less dangerous with time. They are out there right now, off the coast of New Jersey, off Florida, off California, off Hawaii, off Alaska, off a dozen other countries where the United States decided that the ocean floor was the best place to hide the things it no longer wanted to deal with. And they are corroding, one shell at a time. If this story disturbed you, it should. And if you want to see more investigations into the things that governments buried, literally and figuratively, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive. Sometimes the most dangerous secrets are not classified. They are just underwater, slowly rusting, waiting for someone to drag them to the surface. Thanks for watching. Until next time, keep looking beneath the surface.